Hi, folks. This started out a year ago with the conversation between Amir, Herzberg, and myself, where Amir said to me, you know, this nest of issues around cyber war and privacy and national security is really important. And I went back from that conference and I proposed it to INET, and people sort of finally said, yeah, we should do it. Then came the Snowden revelations. And you know, now this is, I think, a very easy discussion to justify. And the only problem is, and you can see it even in the somewhat cumbrous title of the panel, there's just really a ton of topics now wrapped up into each other. But this, anyone who looks at this nest of problems realizes they go very profoundly into notions of things like citizenship and personhood, as well as the usual issues about security, terrorism, and things like that. It probably is the case. Hans Magnus Enzensberger, a German, wrote recently in a study of the Hammerstein family, which was a German general who was skeptical of Hitler, that, well, when the family wanted to go talk, they could all go out into the garden, and really it was pretty much impossible for anybody in the German security systems to know what they said. Now there's no garden anymore. Indeed, I mean, if I felt in a somewhat sick sense, it occurred to me I could almost just welcome all of the listeners here in and out. This thing's streamed live, so how many security services have at least registered in metadata? Who could even make a guess at that now? At any rate, we have four of the best informed and most knowledgeable people on the planet. I don't see any reason to repeat what was just described about them. They'll simply each speak for 15 minutes, and then we're going to take questions from the audience. Amir Herzberg goes first, so I'll now turn it over to him. Yeah, I think you can just speak right into there.
Okay, here we go. Okay. So as Tom said, there are many issues here and about privacy and security. And I would say that the two very basic sub-areas are security and privacy from the government and security and privacy from the private sector. So I believe all the other speakers here are going to focus on the very important subject of security from the government and privacy from the government. I hope later to address questions on that myself. That's certainly a big issue. But kind of Snowden already took the most important thing, the importance and the problem in this should be almost obvious. So I actually decided to focus on the other issue, which is more security and privacy from the private sector. How do I move this on? Okay, like this. Okay, so we are going to talk about, no. What is moving foils here? Not this? It's not moving. Shouldn't this be moving the foils?
One hopes.
Something maybe this? No.
Bear with me. I think you just press it.
I did.
There.
Oops.
Okay. I don't know what.
No. That's not. Okay. I did. No mouse over here. We're going to do it for every file.
Just bear with us for a minute. Let me just.
Somebody can do it manually, and that's it?
No, just.
No?
There. I think it just happened.
Okay. So the issue is really protecting our privacy, and we are telling security professionals, and I'm sure each one of you, to your family and friends, everybody knows we should protect our privacy. And why? Well, because privacy is protecting us from all kinds of threats, from criminals stealing our identity or cheating us or others through our private information in many ways, from organizations, corporations, which where we apply for a job and some something, some picture we've posted or some suspicion that maybe we are ill, then they don't want to insure us and so on, from governments. So there are many motivations for people to protect their privacy, and of course this is not a complete list. And the usual interpretation is that therefore, since privacy protects the individual, then the private information, which constitutes our privacy, belongs to us as individuals. Now, in reality, we know that most people actually share a lot of their personal information with all kind of free, usually free services on the internet. And actually, they allow these services actually to make some use of this information in ways which they believe, according to agreements, user agreements, they believe are okay for them. They don't, so in return to free services, they give the use of their private information. And this looks like a win-win situation. It improves marketing, allows targeted ads, allows the service to improve to improve products and so on. So what's bad about this? And indeed, again, most people do it. They share a lot of their information. Is there any problem with that? Of course, a lot of privacy experts would say there are problems with that and we should restrict that. But why actually? Well, some would say because the citizens do not actually realize the real extent of the threat of sharing their information with these providers. And that may be true, although it's kind of a paternalistic approach to grown-ups usually. I would actually want to focus on a completely different aspect, which is the threat not to the individuals, the threat to society at large, okay? So that's what I will, oh. Okay, no, maybe let's go this way. Okay, good. Okay, so it goes in the reverse way for some strange reason. Anyway, so the thesis is we have this huge mega corporation, data giants, which collect a lot of private information of individuals with consent. Okay, they're not cheating here. And the point is this actually has several concerns, economical, social concerns. So I will discuss a few of them. The first concern is simply the fact that this is a very exclusive club. There will not be a lot of corporations which have access to this vast amount of personal information. Only a few of these data giants, in my belief, will exist. Only a few exist today, and I don't expect the number to grow very much in the future. So we know there's Google, we have Facebook, Yahoo, Microsoft, Amazon, a few more. Why do we have only such few? Because there's a huge startup cost to becoming such a data giant, private data giant. And I will talk about this a bit more later on. So that's one concern, simply the fact that there will be just a small club of these companies which will hold huge resource, huge database of private information. The second concern is the fact that these companies are going to be in an extremely powerful economical position. Essentially, they are going to become, in my opinion, or are already in the process of becoming the ultimate resellers. Resellers, essentially, of everything, of financial information, of travel information, insurance, hardware, software products, media, essentially everything. This is because they will have this huge ability to know their customers in ways which have never been possible before, to customize their offering to the customer, to differentiate prices, to target advertisement, target marketing, in ways which are much better than ever before, to perform all kinds of market research. And this will really make them the ultimate resellers, and they will essentially control the huge market of reselling, of providing of all kinds of services. And as a result of that, I believe there will be also gradually become a growing taxation problem with these corporations, because these corporations are multinational, of course, and the information they get is from all over the world, obviously. But the expenses they do is only wherever they put a data center. The taxes they pay is only where they are registered or they have some corporate identity, which is very limited and very flexible too. So the taxation is not distributed uniformly across the world, and it will be much lower than of other corporations, smaller corporations. So that's another big, big problem. The last problem is actually very different from this, and that is that with the advance of these huge, giant, legitimate data giants, I expect that companies will be looking for alternatives, producers and companies will be looking for alternatives, and one of the only alternatives that may exist will be illegitimate owners of private data, and these will actually exist, so like black hat data giants using all kind of illegitimate ways to collect information for, like spammer today, there will be the extension of spammer using spyware, using penetration and theft of private data from these data giants, and we are already seeing the beginning of this as spammers are becoming more and more adept. Okay, so this is another concern. Okay, so why would these data giants be so powerful? Why do I expect them to be able to become the ultimate resellers? This is because they are really extremely well positioned between the producers and the consumers. And not to mention the fact that they're big corporations, they have these brand images and so on. Other resellers may also have these advantages, few. However, these data giants also have intimate knowledge of their customers. They can do targeted advertisements. They can customize completely the products, the offering, the services that they provide. Customers differentiate the prices exactly according to a specific customer, predict demands, and also compare quality of different producers, different products, by using feedback of the consumers that the consumers are not even aware of providing this feedback. And with the Internet of Things, the amount of feedback that you get will only grow and grow. And while currently there are still limits on the ability to analyze and to conclude all kinds of conclusions from this private information, clearly these corporations will have huge incentive and ability to make better and better algorithms and deductions from this private information. So they will have this huge advantage over any other existing reseller. Okay, and why would we only have just a few of these data giants? This is really because of the initial cost. While this is a very lucrative business to have these huge collections of data of private information, the startup cost until you reach profitability is enormous and is going to grow up and up as the market matures. So the startup cost until you reach the profitability threshold, where the sum of the entire expenses you've expended, you've spent is equal with the amount of profits you're making, this will require deeper and deeper pockets, and it's already very expensive to do it. And once you've reached that point, clearly your marginal costs are very low, because at that point there's the networking effect and you have all the value of the information and so on. So your investment for getting new customers will be really smaller and smaller, and the marginal profit is going to go higher and higher. So very clearly you get to the stable state of a data giant where you have huge amount of private information. But again, only a few corporations, very few, are going to achieve that point. And actually, this kind of figure explains the kind of irrational prices that we see in the market for some of the smaller startup data giants that we've seen, like WhatsApp recently. So to conclude, privacy is not just a private asset, and the focus on the damage to individuals by usage and collection of private information this is indeed a big problem, but it's not the only problem. There is a very important common social problem out of allowing such huge collection and unlimited, unrestricted usage of private information to preserve competition, to allow the market to thrive, to ensure local resources are preserved, and other things. There are other things also which I did not talk about, like ensuring privacy and fairness to other people who have legitimate reasons or good reasons that they prefer not to participate in such services. As these services become more and more ordinary, such individuals will have a bigger and bigger problem. And other researchers actually pointed different other kind of social problems with the loss of privacy. There are arguments that the loss of privacy will result in loss of creativity and even damage to the democratic society. I will not, of course, go into that. So the question is, how do we actually protect privacy? What can we do about all that? And clearly, just explaining this to individual and saying, oh, so now that you understand this privacy is really not just your personal interest, but also interest of society, and hoping that now they will preserve the privacy, this is, of course, absurd, because each to his own, we will continue to sell our privacy cheap, right? I mean, our personal interest will not really change. This is just another case of the classical tragedy of the commons. So that's hopeless. So what can we do? I think it's a big question. It's not, I don't have a simple answer to that. Maybe some restrictions, some careful restrictions on the usage, maybe even on the collection of private information. Maybe some special sort of taxation, especially to help local economies. Maybe self-regulation. Maybe these corporations, we can hope that they have done to some extent, will self-regulate themselves and will not use this huge power in an abusive way. I'm a bit skeptical about that, but I guess that's also a possible approach. Okay, so thank you very much, and I have 1 more minute. So therefore, I will use it just for one comment on the other aspect of the government. Okay, and that is indeed when I talked with Tom long ago, that was something that was really burning in my mind. I just think that today the argument is much clearer. And my argument is very simple now I'm talking about governments and cyber warfare, not just privacy, but cyber warfare in general, and specifically about offensive cyber warfare, about using cyber warfare to attack and to collect information against other governments, to plant malware for other governments, and so on. This is an amazingly effective weapon, definitely. And it is very tempting for countries to use it. For example, you know, in this atomic, in the war against, or the efforts against the development of atomic weapons of Iran, I can understand some governments, including possibly my own, I'm an Israeli, some governments wanting to do this and planting malware and disabling the atomic program to some extent. I can understand it is a powerful weapon. However, this is a double-edged sword. And in proliferating this kind of offensive cyber warfare, you actually are losing the moral ability to complain when other countries are going to do the same to you. And my belief is that the West, democratic nations in general, United States in particular, are not well positioned if cyber warfare is becoming such kind of a dirty war. And it is a big mistake for these Western countries to invest so heavily in the offensive side of cyber warfare. They should invest much more in defense. And the recent accusation that was raised in Bloomberg that the NSA knew for 2 years about the recent bug to the SSL servers, allowing attacks against web users and web servers all over the world, and just use it for offensive purposes and did nothing to stop this attack. Now, I'm not saying this is true. I mean, I cannot check it, of course, right now. However, even the fact that we are kind of naturally, after all these other revelations, we kind of naturally expect that is likely to be true, is just a demonstration of the huge damage caused by this irresponsible use of offensive cyber warfare. It's really important to make a drastic change in policy, in my opinion. But I guess the other speaker will talk about this. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, our next speaker is Steve Bellovin.
So about 10 years ago, someone I know named Alan Schiffman riffed on an old saying of Napoleon's. He noted that in cryptography, amateurs worry about algorithms, pros worry about economics. And the same is true for security in general. It's not secure, insecure. It's How much does it cost the attacker to overcome your defenses? And that's really the important insight. We've been reading a lot over the last several years about the possibility of cyber war. What does it cost the attacker? Is this really a real threat? And I guess the first question is, how hard is it to launch a real attack? Who can launch it? Are we worrying about a bored teenager who runs out of pizza and decides to start Cyber World War I? Do we have to worry about Al-Qaeda, Iran, North Korea? Or is it something that only a major government can do? Does it take a superpower to launch a cyber war? What is the scale of effort that's actually required here? Well, we don't really know for sure because we've never had one. And unlike atom bomb tests, which are big and noisy and anybody can observe them with seismographs and lots of other equipment, cyber war experimentation can happen in a back bedroom, perhaps. Set up a few computers and see what it takes to attack them. But we have a few examples that have been captured from the wild: Stuxnet, Flame, Gauss, and so on. And these teach us something about, these are examples that are pretty definitely government pieces of work. What can we learn about the effort that went into them and the amount of skill and resources necessary to actually launch this kind of attack? So Stuxnet, which attacked the Iranian nuclear centrifuge plant at Natanz, used 4 so-called zero-day attacks. 0 days are ones that are not known to the vendor, so there's no patches available. You can't directly defend against this, even in principle, because there is no fix available. Well, 0 days, especially ones that are of use to governments, go for a lot of money on the open market, probably about $100,000 a piece. And the buyers are security companies who want to sell them to their customers, and of course, intelligence agencies who want to use them for their own purposes. So Stuxnet, to penetrate this very high-value target, used 4 of these things. Someone was willing to spend 4 of these $100,000 resources to attack 1 target. But the centrifuge plant was a hardened target. That behind a so-called air gap, these computers were not connected to the internet. Flame used a previously unknown cryptanalytic technique. No one was very surprised that this could exist because the particular crypto primitive involved, but this is not something that had been published in the open literature. It took a major intelligence agency with really serious cryptographers to come up with this attack, but it was part of the Flame piece of malware. Gauss was so thoroughly obfuscated with parts of it encrypted and so on that no one is yet quite certain what it was doing. And most viruses, yes, it takes effort, but most ordinary viruses are readily reverse engineered by the antivirus companies. These were not amateur efforts. These were well-funded efforts by highly sophisticated agencies. This was not something you could do in your back bedroom. Furthermore, all 3 of these attacks required very, very precise information about the targets. You can't just go Google to find out what kind of motor controllers do the centrifuges use in Natanz. We don't know if it was spying or cyber spying or other forms of intelligence or just good analysis. But what we do know is whoever launched these attacks was not just a cyber warfare unit, but a cyber warfare unit working in conjunction with a major intelligence agency. In other words, a major government. We also have to ask ourselves, how effective is a cyber attack? Is it a hand grenade? Is it a conventional bomb? Is it the modern equivalent of a nuclear weapon? This translates into your doctrine for using these things. When can you use these? What will the effects be? It turns out that cyber weapons are not particularly good. They're not particularly predictable. They're fragile weapons. A minor change in configuration can make a very major change in the effectiveness of one of these weapons. So many of you will have read that as of 3 days ago, Microsoft has dropped support for Windows XP. There will be no more patches. This means that over the last month or so, a lot of places were frantically scrambling to get rid of Windows XP and upgrade to something that was built in this century. That kind of change could completely negate an attack that was designed and prepared under the assumption that the target was running XP. A new patch from Microsoft, a change in the firewall rules, a change in the pattern of connectivity can blunt one of these weapons. For that matter, once you start launching them, people aren't just going to sit there and say, oh, a cyber attack, I'm dead. They're going to try to cope. System administrators, who are the unsung heroes of the computer age, are actually pretty good at recovering things. A lot of these systems that are attacked will be back online a lot sooner than most people realize. A lot of the stealthiness about Stuxnet, by the way, was to keep it hidden, not be big and loud and noisy and cause it to be replaced. But once this thing gets noticed, it didn't take the Iranians very long to get rid of the infected computers and replace them with new ones and prevent it from ever happening again. A lot of the targets can come back online remarkably quickly. This suggests that a cyber weapon is not nearly as effective as, say, a missile or a smart bomb. They have their place, but they're not the kind of thing that there's nothing to do about it. Now, a major cyber warfare unit is going to realize this danger, which is why I suspect that many governments around the world, and it's not just the NSA or not just the NSA and the Chinese, but lots of governments at different levels of effectiveness, but probably a fair number of governments are engaged in what's called preparing the battlefield. They are planting code in various useful and interesting places around the world and the infrastructure of their likely targets. And this code is sitting there and listening for new instructions, and watching for configuration changes. Okay, boss, they just installed patch 1.2.3.4. Time to update the attack strategy. Yeah, the attackers aren't going to go away either. So this is persistent code that's watching for changes that might be getting in the way of some future attack. But because this code is sitting there, probably for years at this point, this creates a new opportunity for the defenders to notice it ahead of time before it can actually be used. So I conclude that cyber war is not as easy and is not as big a threat as some people would say. It certainly can happen. We have seen cyber weapons used as adjuncts to attacks. The most notable, according to numerous published reports, was as an adjunct to the Israeli air raid on a Syrian nuclear reactor, where, according to these reports, somehow the Syrian air defense radars, the Russian-made high-end sophisticated radars, didn't seem to notice anything. Reports say that Israeli cyber warfare units penetrated the computers that run these radar systems and made them not notice anything. Do I know this for sure? No. numerous published reports, yes. And of course, there is Stuxnet. It can be done, it is an adjunct, it is a threat, but it doesn't mean the world is ending. This is not like a nuclear weapon where there is no defense. Anti-ballistic missile systems never would have worked. Cyber war, there does seem to be opportunity for the defenders. The biggest risk is from this persistent code. But again, this also opens up an avenue for the defenders. The bottom line is be cautious, be worried, prepare your defenses, but don't panic. It doesn't mean game over just because you've installed a computer. Thank you.
Thank you. That was perhaps very reassuring. Our next speaker is Bart Preneel.
I could be wrong.
Good afternoon. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here in front of this distinguished audience. In my talk, I wanted to speak about the implications of Snowden's revelations on privacy, or privacy perhaps I should say here, and on national security. Who has heard of the NSA? So few people. Just joking. I think a year ago, probably, in front of this audience, maybe only 10 or 20% would have heard of this. I mean, we are cryptographers, people on stage here. We go to conferences where NSA comes with them. They don't wear long raincoats anymore like they used to 25 years ago, but they're still there spying on us. Even 20 years ago, they used to send beautiful women speaking 11 languages and know nothing about cryptography or security, but just came to talk to us and listen to us. But so, NSA used to be known as, these days are over, unfortunately. NSA used to be known as no such agency, or their slogan is, in God we trust, all others we monitor. But more or less, what they do is collect everything they can, and as far as we've been learning, they're doing an excellent job. So I don't think people in the US should be upset at NSA. NSA has been doing an excellent job. They were told to spy on everybody, and they've done this effectively. Is it so surprising? So maybe it's a bit snob, but I think as somebody of the community, most of the things they do are not so surprising to us. But still, if you look at the whole revelations as far as we have them today, of course, the massive scale and impact is amazing. We did know about submarines, we did know about echelon and satellites, but still what they do today keeps surprising us because of the scale and the budgets. They're very sophisticated in terms of organization and also technically. Just some examples. They had at least 3 ways of getting at Google's data. So they actually had redundancy. They didn't rely on one supplier, on one technology, on one attack. They had 3 different and independent ways. And so if Google now says we've now secured X, Y, Z, it means there is only 2 known ways left, and maybe a few unknowns still as well. Also, they got quite some collaboration from other governments known as the 5 Eyes. This is US, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand. These countries have collaborated for a long time on intelligence. But in fact, most people thought it was restricted to those countries, but it goes way beyond. And most European countries have collaborated with NSA, have given data on their own citizens in exchange for something else. There is no knowledge of what exactly, and there is no democratic control on this. But again, from the Snowden documents, we know that this happens. Also, industry has been forced to collaborate, either through bribery or through security letters, and so they can't speak about this. So even if they make statements like to the best of our knowledge and so on, it actually means nothing because there is these security letters. Also interesting is that they've been engaging in industrial espionage and changing the economic balance. For me as a cryptographer, it's actually very disappointing to learn that NSA has been undermining cryptographic standards. Making crypto standards is a tedious and hard process. And if you then find out that somebody actually undermines the standard in the process and then bribes companies to actually deploy those undermined standards, it's very frustrating. And so in this sense, NSA has done a very bad job. They now undermine the credibility of NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technologies, that deploys or develops cryptographic standards for the US, but in fact for the whole world. So the most spectacular revelation of Snowden, I would say, is what you can call active defense. So we have in the panel here Stephen, who is one of the pioneers of firewalls. This is the front door to defend your network. But in fact, the defense deployed by NSA is actually an offense, and it's very sophisticated technology. What you do is you plant malware in the systems you want to target. And if these people may not connect to the internet or are very important, you subvert the supply chain. So one of them orders a computer, you intercept it in the post, you add an extra component, and then it goes on. And so even if this person never connects to the internet, maybe your component will connect over a network or via radar or via wireless to the internet. The other thing is quantum insertion. Quantum insertion means that if you type an address like google.com or facebook.com or whatever, and you think you get an answer from Google or Facebook, in fact, you get an answer from the NSA. And how does it work? They're just faster. There is nothing with quantum, it's just they're faster than anybody else. And so while you think you are at google.com, you in fact get an answer from NSA. And they use this to put malware on your machine using the Fox Asset program. They look at your machine, decide how important you are. As a function of this, you get malware. So maybe this is all too technical, but in human terms, I would translate this as they have complete control over the network. If you use the internet, in fact, if NSA wants to control your machine, they can. And it's very hard with current technologies to defend yourself. Even if you never hook up to the internet, they can still control your machine if you're of interest to them. And by the way, you become very quickly of interest to them because they have this network of 3 people. So I'm afraid that by being in the same room with me, I should have told you should have switched off your mobile phone, because while you're in the room with me, your mobile phone is on, my phone is on. We now have been in one room for an hour, so you now also become a target. You may get a nice PC next time with an extra device. So another interesting conclusion of Snowden is that it's no longer deniable. So GCHQ keeps sending the same press release over and over, and NSA still makes a different one every time, but it sounds as ridiculous. The defenses no longer sound credible. So what are the implications on privacy? Privacy is a very complex concept that varies from discipline to discipline, that also varies over time. And Amir spoke mostly about privacy against companies, but when we speak about surveillance, of course, we are concerned about privacy against governments. And what governments want is they want information on other people, but they don't want other people to have this information. And there was this dream of governments to do this by putting backdoors, by weakening systems, but unfortunately it's not possible. If you can get to information, others will get there too. The industry is in a very difficult place because they have to deal with all stakeholders. First, governments who knock on their door and ask for all their data. And this can be done through bribery, through security letters asking to give up data, or maybe just by hacking. So in some sense, industry is in a very difficult position. Governments also ask for backdoors. I'm not saying that all Microsoft and Intel things are backdoored, but you may that there is something like an update. So it may be that if you're on the target list, you get a different update from your neighbor. And so maybe the base product is not backdoored, but your update is. Then, of course, industry wants to protect its own content for DRM or software protection. And then also they have to be concerned about their consumers because they may lose their consumers if they don't protect their privacy adequately. Now, if you look at where the loyalties of industry are, it's mostly in their own content and the consumer information they want to exploit. As an example, in Europe, we try to pass in our parliament a much more strict regulation on privacy, which, among others, would have imposed a fine of 5 to 10% of global turnover for serious privacy violations. And what happened was a barrage of amendments. 3,000 amendments were submitted. You should see the pictures of this. It's piles and piles of papers translated in 24 languages, very impressive. But the bottom line is that the regulation, as was submitted by the Commission and discussed by the Parliament 2 years ago, is now completely weakened and hollowed out. Because there is very big company interest, industrial interest against protection of privacy and against restrictions on collecting data. And in the end, you have the citizen who stays behind and is told to be careful and care about his privacy, but in fact, he or she is completely powerless. And in addition, social networks create a new privacy threat, social privacy, where users expose data of each other. But so in general, you have this balance of power between citizens governments and companies or industry. And in Europe, we tend to trust our governments and distrust industry. In North America, at least US, it's the other way around. We distrust government and trust industry. But what we now found out is it doesn't matter. The government gets the data in industry, and government and industry collaborate, in fact. And as an individual, you stay behind, and all your data is in both places anyway. So this is the bottom line, and I think it breaks the balance of power. So how do we respond? In the US, the debate is mostly about violations by NSA of their statutes, so they can't actually eavesdrop on US citizens and US residents. Of course, they can ask the British to do this. This is a different story. So most countries protest mildly. So the parliaments protest, but the politicians don't, the ministers don't, because they get information from NSA in exchange for information from their own citizens. Some businesses threaten to shift away from the cloud in the US. Brazil said they would not buy US airplanes. This is kind of economic sanctions. Some countries call for Splinternet, but of course this would destroy part of the value of the internet and would actually create new risks and new problems of censorship, for example. And some other countries say we want to make security in X, where X is not one of the 5 Eyes nations. And personally, as a European citizen, I would prefer to have security in Europe, because I don't trust French security. It would have a French backdoor. German security would have a German backdoor, but I think European security would be okay, because not all the countries can put in their backdoor, so maybe they would put in none. So maybe that's the answer. Of course, offensively, I'm a bit less pessimistic than Steve. I agree, though, with his conclusion that cyber war is not so easy. But the difference between, say, a ballistic missile or a drone, when you intercept one, you can see how it is built, but copying it is still very challenging. But in fact, with cyber war, you get very quick proliferation. People can reverse engineer the attacks and can learn the attacks. Every head of Secret Service in a major country has gone to their prime minister or their president and said, have you seen what the NSA can do? I want this too. And if they haven't done this, probably their president or prime minister went to them and said, can you do this too? I want this same capability. So we're going to see an enormous proliferation of similar attack of malware insertion. So the big winners will be vendors of memory, because you all will have to buy bigger memory to run all the malware of 27 governments. Okay. So what can we do on defense? Of course, we can defend ourselves better, but this is a very hard task. It's very complex technologies. We can use more crypto, even if NSA goes around it. If you use crypto, you're better defended than if you don't have crypto. We have also privacy-enhancing technologies, such as the Tor network and other things. So with technology, we can protect ourselves better. But we should probably start from scratch, because I don't think we can build a network with active defense in a privacy-friendly way. Essentially, if a foreign government owns your network, how can you protect privacy of your citizens? In general, I think the direction is to go to distributed networks. So we have today big data, and this is where all the economic advantages are, where the exciting developments are. But in fact, we should probably go to local data and small data. Because if we know that if we have big data, we get big advantages, but also get big losses, the governments will get the big data. So when companies have big data, we don't object. But when NSA does big data, we actually get upset. And anyway, NSA gets at the big data of companies. So the only defense is not have big data and keep data locally under control of the user or centrally encrypted. And somehow, I was very pleased with the dinner lecture by John Ralston Saul yesterday. In fact, we do have choices. There are new architectures possible. And you may know the slogan, architecture is politics. The way the internet is designed today is very suitable to governments and to large organizations. But it's perfectly possible to build something like the internet, which doesn't have all those central data stores, and which does not have central control. Internet had some limited attempt to reduce centrality, but as we have it today, it's very central. Think of Skype. Skype actually was a distributed protocol. I don't know whether it still is now, it's owned by Microsoft, but Skype allowed people to call each other without having a central database where everybody had to register. So it is possible to rethink our infrastructure and don't have all this data in a central place. And for the rest, I think we have to have open standardization, community review, and maybe use procurement. So I want to end on this cartoon. So I think what 911 has given us is this kind of approach to security. Essentially, the government has said, give us all your information, we'll give you security. I think what we have today is neither security nor privacy. Thank you very much.
And Ivo Desmedt is our last speaker.
So what is cybersecurity? And so what is actually cyber? And so it's very clear if you look in this room, because you see all these big projectors. In every projector is actually a microprocessor, you could call it a computer. And so how do we have actually this lecture here? We have this lecture due to electricity. The electricity is produced somewhere, and what's controlling the production of the electricity? Computers. And how does the electricity go from the plant, production plant to here? Via distribution. And what controls the distribution? Computers. So you start to see, and also when you think about your mobile, also there is a computer inside. You start to see that computers are everywhere. So then the question is, what's actually the goal of the cybersecurity? And so the goal is actually to protect the rights and the expectations that one has about the data, in particularly when the data is being processed. And the expectations and the rights, they actually depend from time. They evolve, and they also depend whether you are an individual or whether you're a country or whether you're a government. And they depend from country to country. So the list is very long. Privacy is only one of those. Anonymity, for example, being able to complain. So let's look at the case of a CEO who basically gave a donation of $1,000 against or for Proposition 8. If you now give this donation anonymously, then afterwards you don't have to resign as CEO. So anonymity is very important. You can still act as a citizen without actually having to be resigning afterwards. Authenticity is another very important right. How do you make sure that information coming from a source, Bart spoke about that, when you actually think you're talking to Google, how sure are you you're talking to Google and not to NSA? That issue is authenticity. Authorized wiretapping has been mentioned to quite some extent, in the sense that maybe NSA overstepped their authority. Availability, I mentioned you having electricity here so that this lecture can go on, and that means that your computers have to basically be running. Censorship, you could say that's not done in the West. Belgium has a great firewall copied from China, so this is done in the West. Confidentiality is another one. Copyright was mentioned earlier, but also we have the right of delegation. We have many more rights, and so protecting that is basically the goal of the cyber security. So Snowden has been mentioned in this context, but for technical people, we knew, or basically we suspected also a lot of things that NSA was capable of doing. So in 1985 already, there was a book written, The Puzzle Palace, that explained NSA technical capabilities. So people who read this book were not surprised at all by the Snowden revelations. In June 1994, I actually participated at a dinner with 4 people total, and one was from an agency, intelligence agency from one or another European country. And this chap was actually making the claim that NSA is helping US companies win bidding contracts internationally. At that time, it sounded completely far-fetched, and none of us actually believed this chap. But nowadays, after Snowden, these accusations might actually be true. So last year, I actually made a proposal for intelligence agencies to change the target of what actually they should target to collect intelligence. And my philosophy is as follows. When you look at Marx said that capital and also property can be abused. And so therefore the solution is to give production in the hands of the government. So now what have we heard many times is that data can be abused. And so therefore it should be in the hands of the government. So I call that cyber communism. So I think that in a communist country, it makes a lot of sense to spy on the citizens. But in a non-communist country, we actually are doing the same as what Marx actually advocated. We're giving the data in the hands of the government, why it should remain private. And so Bart also mentioned that, the differences between different countries. So we are in North America. We don't trust the government. So therefore, what should actually happen is the intelligence agency, they should spy on the government and they should spy for us. Don't forget the Constitution of the United States starts with we, the people. No, we are in charge, not the government. And that's how it should be. A very interesting observation is PRISM is mentioned on one of the slides that Snowden actually leaked, or that actually from the 40 slides, the 10 or so that the newspapers were willing to publish. On one of those was PRISM, but still today we don't know what it actually is. There have been all kinds of interesting reactions from 10 UK scientists asked the NSA to leak their weakening techniques, as if they would do that. More interesting, I think, is actually what happened in Asia. India has switched to old-fashioned typewriters for top-secret data. Apparently, Russia was already doing that for a long time. Russia pre-Crimea radio silence deceived Western agencies, and the Western agencies weren't prepared. So now China, I heard recently, China is now avoiding Cisco equipment. And Huawei, which is a large Chinese telecommunication corporation, has offered a salary of $500,000 per year for a researcher to start a research group in China. So in the West, what we see, on the other hand, is that CEOs are continuing to switch to Gmail. Before, what we had is that every corporation basically was maintaining their own mail system, and also universities were. Nowadays, that's no longer the case. They want to outsource it, and so Gmail is one example, Hotmail is one. And also, the US government actually wants to deploy what's called the cloud. And so the CIA, certain data for the CIA will actually now be managed by a private corporation. I'm not so sure that this is the right approach. I think the West is still going in the wrong direction. So the next issue is basically cyber war and cyber terrorism. So cyber terrorism was originally, when we were all contacted to be on the panel, was originally in the title, and then it was removed. So I do realize that there are technical difficulties with actually organizing that. But I do believe that it's oversold, that since there hasn't been a major cyber terrorist attack so far, it will never happen. So some believe that actually bringing down the critical infrastructure will be hard. And one thing that some people have said is that when you hack a computer which is used in the critical infrastructure, it doesn't mean that you now know what to do with that. That reminds me of the first World Trade Center attack done by Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda basically said, okay, we're going to put a bomb in the basement of the World Trade Center. And it made a big boom and a lot of dust, and a few people died. And it didn't have the impact they had hoped to. So what did they do? They learned the lesson, and they actually then had a mechanical engineer helping them doing their second attack, which was unfortunately successful. So when you look at countries as China and Russia, it is for sure that they have enough control engineers. So once they will have hacked into systems, that they actually know what to do next. So the question is, how bad is it? Steve said everything is perfect and fine. You didn't actually say that. But so if you look, there was a commission set up by the President Clinton called the Presidential Commission on Critical Infrastructure Protection. And they forgot to add food production and distribution as a critical infrastructure. It's amazing, isn't it? So then if you look at a control level, already in the 1980s, people were saying you should use authentication. This is a technique I mentioned earlier to make sure that you know to who you talk. Still today, in many cases, this technique is not used. I'm not going to mention examples, but in many circumstances should be used, is not used, this technology. So if you then look at a hardware level, we see more and more hardware with actually malware. And the case of Windows XP was already mentioned at the software level. The most frightening of all is if you now think about you at home what should you install in order to actually make your computer secure? One day you may actually get an email saying, look, we have found out that your computer is not secure, you should buy this product. And then you click on this link. And what actually happens is that they will ask you credit card information, etc. But unfortunately, it's called scareware. So scareware is a technology which does nothing except make your computer insecure. So you think that you're buying a product that actually will make your computer more secure. But no, it makes your computer less secure. And you pay for it. And you give these people your credit card information. Okay, so it's really bad. And then there are also other vendors that don't do that bad things. They only sell snake oil. Evidently, there are solutions. And Bart spoke about some of this in the research, etc. But you have to be aware of what you do, and it's not so easy, in particularly when you're not an expert and you get such emails, what to do with them. In general, don't click on links that you get when you get email. So there are also economic aspects. Some of you may have heard about the attack against Target. It's very interesting to see the blame game that goes on. In Europe, people use the chip cards for their credit card and debit cards. In America, that's not the case. I mean, at least in the United States. And so what happens is that shops as Target say, look, the problem is the fact that the US banks don't use that. And the US bank says, no, it's actually the attack happened because your computer were being hacked. So there's a blame game taking place. Then other economic aspects is, so one question that we were actually debating before the panel is why hasn't cyber terrorists happened? And the reason is there is no economic incentive for a hacker to actually do a cyber terrorist attack. And if they find the weakness, they can actually sell it for $100,000. So there are other incentives. They can go work for spammers and basically all kinds of other applications. But cyber terrorism for a hacker is not a high priority. Evidently, for cyber war, it's different. And then the question is, what incentive actually is there for a company to protect against cyber war? And even if one company decides to protect against cyber war, another also protects against cyber war, what do we have on a macroeconomic viewpoint? So we could debate whether we can have a worse scenario or not have a worse scenario. And so Steve mentioned that often after the attack, it is easy to recover. There are situations where this is not the case. If you attack a substation and you attack enough substations, there are not enough substations basically in stock to recover. So when you do an attack by using cyber, you must make sure, if you really want to do really bad damage, that it has a long-term impact. So if this is taken into account, the question is, if we then have a city that doesn't have electricity for, let's say, 2 years, how can we recover from that? There is no plan for what to do the day after. It's very interesting to see that the Romans, once they had actually realized that their aqueduct systems were vulnerable, when they built the new city, Constantinople, they actually built the cisterns because they realized the vulnerability of their aqueducts. Another interesting case is what happened with the Bank of Italy, which then became the Bank of America, after the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, which caused a big fire. Amadeo Giannini took the money home. All the other banks put the money in the vault. The vaults became so hot from the fire that for days they couldn't be opened. And so it was the Bank of Italy that then changed its name to Bank of America that actually had the money and could allow people to borrow the money. So certain times you don't have to have a plan in advance, but some smart person actually thinking about the day after, what will he do the day after, is actually sometimes quite important. So we should actually think about if we have a really bad the cyber war or cyber terrorism event where people have very carefully planned, then we need to think about a non-electrical backup to at least be able to restart the system and not have its impact being too large. And another issue is what's the economic cost of lack of privacy, and Amir addressed that, but also you see the economic aspects are important. And finally, I will end with the irrational thinking that's sometimes happening by decision makers that basically says, we haven't been hacked. So why do we want to buy all this security the protection? And so, yeah, they wait until then they're being hacked, which is not the right policy. Thank you.
All right, I thought we might ask each member of the panel if they want to make a 1-minute comment on anything they've heard, and then immediately open up for questions. Anybody here want to comment?
I'd be happy to comment on Steve's.
What's that?
I'll be happy to comment on what Steve
Okay,
said.
by all means, by all means.
Yes.
So,
I don't think your mic's working. I might be wrong.
is it? I seem to be working. Okay, hear me or not? I can go there. I seem to be working out. Okay, so I just want to comment briefly on what Steve said about attacks being so not so trivial to launch. And indeed, the examples that Steve gave are of very complex and non-trivial attacks. I completely agree with them. However, my concern is that these are not the only kind of attacks that we have seen, and definitely not that we will see. And in particular, attacks whose goal is to cause damages, like actually what Ivo has described at the end, attacks on the power grid, attacks on the network itself, are things which do not require so much sophistication. We have seen techniques are known, and which can make very significant damages with very modest and simple mechanisms. And also, we actually do see such attacks. I disagree with the statement that we don't see such attacks. Well, again, being an Israeli, I can tell you that we have attacks all the time on the internet infrastructure. These attacks so far are not very sophisticated. We know that they are actually not sophisticated. We know that they are not using the tools as well as they could do, but that's just a matter of improvement and nothing so complex. And the techniques are, a lot of them are even published and known. It's just a matter of the attackers currently not being sophisticated enough. I hope this will continue, but you cannot depend on this.
I don't disagree that there are attacks, but what we see today is the equivalent of the terrorist attack.
That's what I said.
Where I say it's a lot harder is to do serious, permanent damage to an enemy country. I do worry about the power grid. Ivo is quite correct about the vulnerability of the transformers, that there aren't enough spares. In fact, my paper specifically mentions the power grid as an example where recovery from that kind of physical damage will be a lot harder. But wars don't happen because someone has a weapon. We have not had a nuclear war, despite the fact that since 1947, there have been at least 2 nuclear-armed powers on this planet who really didn't like each other. Even during the Cold War, no one was really worried about what was called a boob attack, bolt out of the blue. Khrushchev was not going to wake up with a headache one morning and press the button. It was going to be the culmination of international tension. Digital Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor wasn't a surprise. Everyone in Washington knew that war with Japan was about to break out about that day. The only thing they didn't know was where, and they guessed wrong. If there's ever a cyber war, it will be the same way. Because there's going to be a war, not because someone found a cute new hack.
Anyone else?
I just want to comment that defense is very expensive. Because if you want to defend against this, it's very expensive because it also involves the private sector. I mean, there is, in the military area, it's clear the military is at the borders or on defense or attack, but in cyber war, it's everywhere. It's in the civilian infrastructure. And so this is why defending it is very difficult. You have to involve the industry, and you have to convince the industry to spend enough in the national interests, and this may be very challenging.
Can I take issue? I actually want to take issue with that because my feeling is that governments are investing a lot in offensive cyber warfare, and I don't think that the amounts that they are spending on offensive cyber warfare are smaller than the necessary amounts to do defensive cyber warfare. first of all, the two things do not actually replace each other. By having offensive cyber warfare, you do not prevent attacks against your own system, terrorist attacks and so on. So that's just irrelevant. But furthermore, the expenses that governments spend on in all over the world right now, because this now with Snowden, it's blown out of proportion, and all the governments in the world are thinking, no, we must have these abilities. And the expenses required to develop good defenses are not higher. In fact, they are lower. Governments should have invested in them. For example, consider the SSA library. Why didn't the government, I'm not talking about even the fact that the government apparently, or people claim they knew about it for 2 years and so on. But government should have invested in checking such software, in finding such bugs, in finding security flaws in internet protocols that we know, that we explore. Government is not actually investing significantly in these protective areas, which could have helped the entire industry.
I think Ivo's trying to
So
say.
I think that the point of defense that you make is very good. Unfortunately, when you talk to people in the military in the United States, I'm not going to mention names because with the current policy, anybody who basically talks against the president who is in the military loses his job or her job. So what people have told me is that when the defense was given when the cyber aspect of security was decided by the Obama administration, it was given to NSA. And what other people, including myself, have argued is that if you look in the history, we first basically had the Army, then afterwards we had the Navy, and then we had the Air Force. So cyber is the next one. And cyber as a defense should be given to people who understand defense of a country. And so I think that by the decision to give it only to NSA, that NSA then has seen that as basically the wild card to use it to go infest a lot of computers in the world and make them more vulnerable. So the mistake has been made at that level. It should have been given, I'm not saying to the Army, I'm not saying to the Navy, I'm not saying to the Air Force, but a fourth force, a cyber force should have been created that then is going to look into defense and defense mechanisms.
All right, I think I'd better stand up just because it's almost impossible to see over these lights. Who would like to ask questions? Just raise your hand and maybe say who the question's for, but everybody will get a chance to comment. Let's back over there.
Hi, Walker Todd here. We recently switched from Windows-based machines to Macs at home, and we're told that not to worry because at Apple headquarters they screen everything, you won't be bothered by bugs. So would the panel comment on that? And secondly, in light of what we now know about NSA, has anyone seriously proposed in Washington that we give up and say to NSA, okay, you can read everything, but you will agree to do complete backup of my computer, and you will be the front line of defense against viruses?
So, I'm a Mac user also. I do not regard it as a panacea. I do not regard it as less vulnerable. Why do I use Macs? Because I think I'm more productive that way. Windows is actually quite secure. It's also a much bigger target. If 95% of the computers, laptops, desktops, whatever, are running Windows and you're an attacker, why should you go after the Macs? Most hacking today is for profit. 95% of the money is makeable by attacking Windows. Again, I'm a Mac user. I don't delude myself that it's more secure.
Anyone
I
else?
don't really have anything. No one's going to take your suggestion serious about the NSA being the universal backup, so...
Yeah. Would you feel, Walker, would you feel safer if, as the president has proposed, Verizon held your data? The question is rhetorical. Yeah. Is there a next question? Oh, yep.
Not a lot of comments on China and sort of their strategy, and I'm curious what their thoughts are, the panel.
Did you hear the question? Comments on China and its internet surveillance and cyber war strategies.
Surveillance in China.
Of the net by China, of their strategy.
I'm happy to comment if that can help.
Yeah.
So I think first in terms of cyber defense and attack, I mean, there was a lot of outrage or outcry about 1.5 years ago about the Mandiant report, which identified a unit of the Chinese army in Shanghai doing more or less the same things as we find in the Snowden report. Maybe not the same level of sophistication, but the US was very outraged that somebody else dared to do the same thing. Now, on the other hand, of course, in China there is control. There is what's called the Great Firewall of China. And so there is, at a large scale, censorship. So, for example, inside China, Google and Facebook are not accessible. There is, of course, social media where there is constant censorship. So hundreds of thousands of people are there to watch what's being said, report it, maybe change it. There is also tools like Tor, the onion router system. It's a tool created, in fact, or invented by a research lab of the Navy, and then handed over to a nonprofit. And this tool is used by spies, by police forces to go after criminals, but also by right activists in many countries. It's also used by citizens of China, Iran, and so on to use the internet and to circumvent or bypass censorship. And so to actually visit websites which are not accessible in mainland China. And there is a constant arms race happening. So the Chinese government keeps trying to block more of Tor, and the Tor people try to improve Tor so they actually can bypass the firewall. It's a constant arms race. Also in the Snowden documents, there was a revelation about Tor, which is a couple of years old. It said we can de-anonymize users, but not all of them. So it's a quite good system because it was not designed to be resistant against an opponent like NSA. But in general, my advice to society is invest more in Tor-like tools. They have bad uses. Of course, drug dealers also use them. But they have so many good uses that we should actually invest more in those things as a defense measure. It will also help countries or activists in countries like China, Iran, and free speech on the internet in general.
Every major government has cyber espionage and cyber warfare programs in place. We have heard more about the NSA. We've heard more about China. It doesn't mean others aren't doing it. There was a report out of the US government not very many years ago which identified not just China but also Russia as big players in economic espionage. A non-American friend of mine a few years ago had a conversation with an officer of his country's army who told him that, according to this country's information, 130 nations around the world had cyber warfare units in their militaries. I'm sure that there's a great deal of variation in the sophistication. It's not just the NSA, it's not just China, it's not just Russia. It's all of those and many more.
Bart mentioned the Great Firewall of China. But the Great Firewall of China also had some economic consequences. So when you go to China and you talk to people there, they actually have their own version of the Google for searching the internet. They have their own version of Twitter, and they have their own version of Facebook. And if you compare that to Europe, where they have a firewall in certain countries, they don't have that. And the reason is very clear, is that the Europeans have not understood how the great Chinese firewall works. The firewall of China does two things. It censors incoming data, but it also prevents data to go out. That last aspect has not been done in Europe. And as a consequence of that, Europeans export their data all the time to the United States.
There's right there. That's you.
Hi, Baruch Vogel from FCS. I just would like to ask the committee one simple question. I'm very surprised that nobody has addressed the alleged attack on Cuba, call it a cyber terrorism or government-sponsored attitude adjustment, but I'm very surprised nobody's mentioned it.
It's I assume what you're referring to is the reports that U.S. government agencies sponsored their own Twitter-like social network to try to influence things, map a social graph. This is not new. You think Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty aimed at Cuba. This is governments do propaganda. What else is new? You know, once upon a time they did it on radio. Before that it was printed material. Now it's the internet. This is what governments do. Remember the movie Casablanca? I'm shocked to find this gambling going on here. Governments will do this. You know, you may not like it, but you shouldn't be surprised.
The difference being that now they have the data of the actual people that is doing it.
Now they have the data on the actual people. Again, governments spy. This is what they do. You know, you can't. You may not like it, but it shouldn't be shocking to anybody. Disinformation has also been out there for a very long time by governments around the world.
I guess the good thing is in Cuba, very few people have access to the internet. I was teaching there 2 years ago, and in fact, very few people have access to the internet. So in some sense, it's not very powerful to use online tools there. They're probably one of the safest nations in terms of cybersecurity today.
Yeah. There's a question back, yeah.
Gregor Semenyuk from the New School. Those of us who don't think about all this interconnectedness and where all the computers sit, maybe I would be interested, what would be some sort of a worst case scenario so that we can think of the day after? What does it involve? What can be a bad consequence of a cyber attack that those of us who don't have really an overview of what's all going on the cyber level? I didn't know about the infiltrating things that aren't connected to the internet, and that was worrying me. Can you give some, not alarmist, but realistic perspectives? Thank you.
So I will give you just one example, and I can make more. I wrote a paper about that, but so I'm just going to give you one example, which is about food production and food distribution. Every time that you go buy something, that actually there are barcodes being used. And that means that the shop actually doesn't need bookkeepers, etc., to actually do all this. It's all computerized. So you can now see what impact that has. And I was speaking to people from the FBI after the major shutdown of electricity that happened at Impact in Tennessee for a week. And the consequence was that the shops had actually to close. But there are much more frightening scenarios. If you think about equipment which is being used to plant plants, or actually put the seeds. If you plant the plant too deep, then what's going to happen is that it will not produce the fruits you expect it to actually produce. And you will have to wait a whole season before you actually can realize that. So there are really nasty attacks that you can do by going to hack the machines. As I said, they are controlled by a microprocessor. The process of planting plants, that you can have very bad consequences. Also, if you look, just continue to food, you can also disturb the distribution of food. So the problem there is that we were speaking about the impact of, for example, substations, where then for 2 years it will take before you have electricity again. Another problem is how long is it going to take before you realize that you have a vulnerability? Okay, it was mentioned in the case of OpenSSL that NSA already knew this for 2 years, and that now actually the open community only learned about it now. So if you think about food the production, when this attack takes place, if you don't check the software all the time that actually is being used, then you may be in for surprise. This is just one attack scenario.
Anyone else?
I would say that the examples Ivo gave are good, but and in general, I would say that the thinking I believe government should think is about, are there some guidelines, are there some agreements that could be reached internationally about limits to cyber offensive operations? Because this sort of havocing of equipment, of devices, possibly in the design phase, are things which are possible, because everything is designed by computers. If you can hack into the computers in advance, you can implement all kinds of these attacks, even if these devices are not connected to the network. And of course, there's all this Internet of Things now approach, which would actually connect these devices to the network. So it is, in my opinion, it is very important to reach some international agreements limiting the use of such offensive cyber warfare technologies before it is too late.
I worry about things that cause permanent physical damage or serious physical damage, which you can't repair by rebooting your computer and reinstalling Windows. The power subsystem, oil and gas pipelines, things like that, if they are damaged by a cyber attack, then you've got very bad problems, because you can't reboot and repair. Food distribution, if it gets interrupted, we can probably restart it. Less efficiently, but we can probably restart it. A big electrical transformer, physics of electricity. If you want to send electricity over long distances, you've got to use very high voltages. It's just simple physics. To convert it down to something we can use in our houses, you need a transformer. These big transformers are custom made, they're expensive, they're very long lead time items. There are not nearly enough spares. I worry a lot about that. I know less about the physics of and control of pipelines, but Ivo mentioned something about 1983. I'll skip the details. There was a computer-caused massive pipeline explosion in the Soviet Union, allegedly caused by the CIA tampering with the software of a computer that was illegally exported from the US to the Soviets. I don't think they planned the explosion. I don't think they were sorry that it happened.
My nightmare scenario would be an attack on nuclear power stations. I think you hope it never happened, but I think you could recreate Fukushima at a much larger scale. And this is not unthinkable. I don't think you can include this. The good news is that most of these old power plants have analog controls. I spoke to several engineers in Belgium, and for example, in Western Europe, there is many of those nuclear power stations in heavily populated areas. And if one would be able to do a cyber attack on those and make them blow up, I think then you get large physical damage, which Steve was speaking about. You just hope it doesn't happen and the people don't modernize the infrastructure, put it online, and then don't think.
There could be also attacks on production of medicines. The limit of when you think about beginning to use cyber attacks against all kind of production of devices and products, it is essentially endless, right? It's much easier to do damage than to do good. We should remember that. And therefore, again, I believe that all the nations should actually try to prevent this sort of offensive warfare.
Okay, let's try. Question there.
How vulnerable is the banking system?
Did you hear that? How vulnerable is the banking system? I mean, this question, of course, we now know the biggest threat to the banking system is certainly bankers. But now we'll just take that as a friendly amendment to your question and go on. Yeah. All of you can comment. Use that.
I think the banking system first, they've been involved with security for a long time. I've been working with them for a long time, and they were the first to use cryptography in a commercial environment. I think they understand the risks of their payment transfer systems. I think also if somebody breaks into the banking system, some money goes out, but it has to go somewhere. And so usually in our financial world, we can find it back or we can undo the transaction. For individual citizens, we can actually refund them if something bad happens. And in fact, there is no other loss. So in some sense, it's not the most risky. What you do see is, in fact, on the one hand, you see with chip and PIN standards increasing. On the other hand, with contactless payments, standards of security are lowering. But then I guess they have a big risk management system. So I'm not so concerned about retail. For wholesale, it seems that the security went a bit down because I think they had proprietary solutions until the late 90s, which were very well researched. Then they switched to commercial off-the-shelf things, where I think the risk increased, but I think they make a step backwards now, and I think they have a wake-up call. But I'm not so concerned about the wholesale system. Again, it's a few banks, a few thousand banks. It's a very controlled system. You can't just make $1 billion disappear there.
Yeah.
I actually agree with Bart. However, there is another part of the financial and banking system which I'm very concerned about, and that is the securities markets. Security markets, I think, are very vulnerable. And attacking security markets, also for profit, but definitely if you just want to sabotage, is extremely easy because they are invoked by orders. There are automated ordering machines. And then such attacks have also been done to promote stocks and so on. These are things which are done by attackers all the time, but haven't been done in a big way. But this is definitely doable. Creating a crash in the market is very easy because attackers are controlling a huge fraction of the computers right now. Huge fraction. People talk about a third or maybe a quarter. Let's say it's a quarter, okay, which is kind of the lower estimate that anybody would have. But if you control a quarter of the computers, just think, what will be the impact of issuing orders using a quarter of the customers? so the stock markets are extremely, security markets, in my opinion, are extremely vulnerable. And with the algorithmic trading systems, an attack on algorithmic trading systems, hard to imagine the results.
The banks have understood computer security for a lot longer than most other companies. They've actually taken a lot of precautions. They do a pretty good job. Not perfect. There have been some fairly spectacular attacks against banks. In principle, a lot of the malicious financial transactions can be unrolled. It'd be chaos for a few days or even a few weeks, but I think a lot of it could be recovered from. There are risks, make no mistake about it. There's an article published a few years ago that the NSA actually had a plan to steal Saddam Hussein's foreign reserves by electronic funds transfers out of Iraqi or Iraqi-controlled bank accounts to the West, and this was vetoed in Washington for fear of what it would do to the international financial system. It's not clear that this is still possible. This is, more than 10. This is a dozen or so years later, more since that almost took place. But it's not at the top of my list of worries. Concern, yes. Critical, yes. But it's not the kind of physical damage that I worry about most, and they are more sophisticated than most at defense. Willie Sutton, the bank robber, was allegedly once asked, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. Well, the banks know they've got the money.
Banks have been working indeed for many years, not just on actually using the information security technology, but also some famous researchers have worked for banks. Then they have their own conference, and also they have their own standards. So yeah, I agree with all of you. Those are the least to worry about. I'm not saying that the system is perfect, far from, but there are bigger concerns if you look at other sectors.
Okay, we have about 2 minutes left. I wanted to ask the panel a question I think is probably on the brains of a lot of folks in this room. And that is to say, we're not specialists in computer security. And we sort of, if there are a lot of economists around, and when Amir mentions that privacy is also a common resource as well as an individual attribute, and that you have a world of big data producers that are an oligopoly, to us, that's going to mean there's probably going to be some big information problems simply trying to find out what's going on. What do people here read if they try to follow developments in an intelligent fashion about this, to form a sort of sensible opinion, just sort out the claims, not only of the government, but of the private companies who kept insisting they didn't know anything when it is now overwhelmingly evident that many of them knew a great deal about what was going on. What would you tell the folks out here in this last minute or two that we've got? What can they read?
No one source. No one source gets it right all the time. Mainstream reporters, however well-intentioned, often get technical details wrong. But if you read a variety of major publications, in the US, it's the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, there's Bloomberg News, there's The Economist, the Financial Times. There are a lot of different media. I read a lot of these things, but this is what you've got to do. You've got to go read a lot and filter it.
Who's next? I hope you won't tell me the European papers don't do this differently, because I read a bunch of those languages and they do. They print a lot more. Well.
I think there's definitely a good source. I think if you want slightly more technical information, you can follow Slashdot.
Right.
Slashdot is I mean, of course, there's a lot of techie things, but it's a very good overview, and you can filter it for security information. There is also some researchers have very good blogs, I think, where they translate the news and critically comment. And I think via Slashdot, you will end up there very often. And that's a way to get to see the broader picture, I would say, outside the news media.
Anyone else?
So another source is encyclopedia, and there are certain encyclopedia that actually have put in a chapter in their encyclopedia about security, and that's another source.
All right, thank you all very much, and thanks especially to the panel for this session.